or good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Mike Sfraga. I want to welcome you all to the Polar Institute's Arctic Public Square discussion entitled Ukraine and the Arctic: Perspectives, Impacts, and Implications. I'm pleased to host this discussion with our colleagues at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Let me say at the outset, on behalf of all of us at the Polar Institute, I extend warm thoughts, prayers, and well wishes to our colleagues, to our friends, and to the people of Ukraine during this terrible time in their nation's history. Today's program is a bit more somber. It's very different from other programs, but I think it's critical for the Arctic and the global community. So I want to thank all of you, all 775 colleagues who are joining us today for this discussion. I'd also like to share that this program is part of a Wilson Center-wide effort called Hindsight Upfront Ukraine. And I would encourage you to go to our center's website to take a look at a rich resource of Ukraine-focused policy perspectives and discussions. In fact, I would encourage you to join the center at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for an important discussion about Ukraine between the Wilson Center's president and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green, and our colleague, Baroness Catherine Ashton. Lady Ashton was the European Union's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security. Again, there's more information on the Wilson Center's website, and I encourage you to participate in that important discussion. We are, as always, thankful to the leadership of Laguna Corporation and the community of Wainwright, Alaska, for their continued and unwavering support of our institute. They have provided foundations and means for us to bring to you programs like today's event and similar work throughout the year. I also thank my Wilson Center colleagues for their support, including Ambassador Green, the Kennan Institute, the Canada Institute, our Global Europe program, and the Environmental Change and Security program. As always, my colleagues Jack Durkee and Michaela Stith make these happen, along with Shreyan back at the studio at the Wilson Center and the entire broadcast team. Allow me, colleagues, to take a few minutes to set the context for today's program. We thought about having this program 2 weeks ago, and we thought that was premature as the world unfolded before us. And then emails, texts, phone calls from colleagues from around the world solidified our thoughts that a program like this, and in fact, more programs like this on this subject, are needed. So that's the context and the background for today. It was our thought to do this, but it was you, our colleagues, who encouraged us to do this. We thank you for it. In the past, we've discussed the changing contours of the Arctic. We've done so in venues such as this, at international meetings, in private dialogues, publications, and with colleagues in the press. We've done so in the context of climate change in the Arctic, commodities and resource development in the Arctic, commerce and economic development in the Arctic, connectivity in the Arctic, the people and communities in the Arctic, the spirit and real, purposeful and productive cooperation in the Arctic. And we have voiced concerns competition in and outside of the region could escalate to create conflict in the Arctic. And now we find ourselves gathered here today to share perspectives about and place into context an invasion of a sovereign country in Europe and the implications such an action is having and could have on all facets of the Arctic region. Many, if not all of us in this Arctic public square today have reinforced the unique and at times exceptional nature of the Arctic, where all 8 Arctic nations have worked together despite our differences to craft, govern, explore, investigate, and help advance a region that is stable and committed to the rule of law and international norms. And to a significant degree, the 8 Arctic nations have been able to do so until now. Now we are faced with the reality of a different type of level of Arctic engagement, of Arctic cooperation, a different Arctic geopolitical landscape. In the past 18 days, you and I have witnessed the fabric of Arctic cooperation fraying because of the actions of one Arctic nation outside of the Arctic region. But the implications of these actions have rippled through every facet of the Arctic. We recognize no country, no region, no people, no global commodity, no bilateral or multilateral framework is immune to the impacts of this global shockwave. We indeed gather at an inflection point in our history, and there are real implications for the Arctic. As a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on a scale not seen since World War II, we are, I believe, witnessing and experiencing the second in a pair of historic bookends being set in place. These post-Cold War bookends contain the history of 33 years, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to today. And within these bookends, you will find the volume that tells the story of the Arctic. And now it's up to us to discuss, consider, inform, and influence the next volume, the post-Cold War Arctic. Will it be one of cooperation, qualified cooperation? Will it include all Arctic nations? Can it? Will all Arctic nations be able to address in a meaningful manner the cause and effect of climate change in and outside of the region? Will we need new or refined frameworks, organizations, structures to address the challenges of a new globalized Arctic at this moment in our history? Just recently, Robert Gates, the former US Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA, said, quoting him, "Our so-called holiday from history is over," unquote. What does that mean for our Arctic? What does that mean? Our region is connected to the entire globe. We know that. We talk about it together each day. We see these connections. Arctic nations such as the United States, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, and Norway, they're NATO member states. We are aware of the role Russia's Arctic natural gas and oil play in the global energy equation. Our colleagues in Europe are acutely aware of this fact. NORAD is a key component in securing the North American Arctic, the US homeland, as well as allies and partners abroad. We are very well aware Russia's Northern Fleet, second strike capabilities, and submarine fleets are based in the Arctic. We track the discussions happening in Sweden in regard to that nation's perspectives on potential NATO membership. We too listen attentively to public opinion and political discourse in Finland regarding NATO membership, a country that shares a border with Russia that spans more than 800 miles. Many of us participating today know the Arctic has many dimensions, not just security. There are a wide array of social, cultural, environmental, economic, political aspects of the Arctic that, as at this moment, are feeling the tensions originating in Europe. We can feel them. We can see them. From Ukraine to the Yukon, we see how connected, interdependent, and integrated we really are. However, a peaceful and stable Arctic requires a high level of cooperation and foundational trust. But we see such cooperation being altered in ways we may not have imagined just a few weeks ago. Bilateral and multilateral Arctic frameworks and organizations have paused or altered their work with Russia, geographically the largest Arctic nation, now on the sidelines of important work that needs to be done on behalf of all citizens of the Arctic and the globe. This, my friends, is the context in which we meet today to conduct this first in a series of upcoming Polar Institute Arctic Public Square discussions regarding the impacts and implications the war on Ukraine is having, and we will have, and the impacts they will have on the Arctic region. So these are my contextual remarks, somber in nature, but real, and issues that we must talk through. And I'm very pleased that the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs is joining us for these very, very important discussions. With that, let me introduce our colleagues and experts that will speak to us today. We have Dr. Ulf Sverdrup, Director, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, Mr. Jim DeHart, U.S. Coordinator for the Arctic region at the U.S. State Department, Dr. Julie Kitka, President of the Alaska Federation of Natives, Dr. Ilana Wilson-Rowe, Research Professor, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, Dr. Lawson Brigham, a Global Fellow at the Polar Institute, a Fellow at the Center for Arctic Study and Policy, the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, and an advisor to the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. We have Marisol Maddox, Senior Arctic Analyst at the Polar Institute, and Katarina Kurtsiova, Senior Fellow, European Leadership Network, and a Global Fellow at the Polar Institute. With that long introduction, let me introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Ulf Sverdrup, to get our conversation going. Ulf, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks for organizing this very timely and important event. And let me also thank the audience and participants who have joined in this morning. See, now something happened on my screen, so I just have to, We at NUPI really enjoy cooperating with the Wilson Center under your leadership, Mike. We have cooperated with the Arctic Security Roundtable and the Munich Security Conference, and now we look forward to extend this cooperation further. To kick us off today, I've prepared a few slides to provide a bit of a situational awareness as the situation is seen now from Norway. I will touch briefly on how we observe some rapid changes regarding the military, diplomacy, energy, finance, and finally something about alliances. So Jack, can you be so kind and please click on my slide, so to the next slide, please. So the immediate military situation in the high north bordering Norway. What we see is that there is still a mutual interest in maintaining stability in the high north. Russia has neither an interest nor a capacity to create a new front, and actually Russian troops and resources have been moved from Kola to Ukraine. Norway is responding to this in a, I would say, a careful manner. Of course, we are part of the NATO response mechanism. We are conducting, as we speak, today, the pre-planned biannual cold response NATO exercise. This is executed as planned, and the Norwegians and NATO refrain from doing exercising in the northernmost region of Norway. So it's taking place far away from the Russian border. Russia has been invited as an observer, but they have declined participation. Next slide, please. As many of you know, the High North policy or the Arctic policy have been a balancing act between deterrence on the one hand and assurance mechanism, where scientific and diplomatic and economic engagement have contributed to reduce tensions and conflict. Norway, we of course in Norway wants and needs some kind of cooperation with Russia, but I think a big issue is how and to what extent this is possible and how desirable it will be as we go along. So the two pictures here show the Norwegian foreign minister. This was after the war broke out in the invasion. She said that Norway would continue to try to cooperate with Russia, but then just a few days later, it was announced that the Arctic Council members suspend participation over Russia's invasion over Ukraine. So we are badly in need of finding some way of or how to thinking about what kind of diplomatic framework we should have. Jack, please, next slide. Now, the situation in Ukraine has also, I would say, dramatically changed Norway's position in the European energy landscape and the strategic importance also of Arctic energy resources. Norway is a huge provider of energy, gas and oil to Europe, and the crisis has increased the importance of Norwegian energy into Europe. At the same time, Europe is now moving out of Russian oil and gas. Last week, the EU launched this initiative called Repower EU, basically moving rapidly out of Russian oil and gas. I think this means that energy extraction in the high north, in the Arctic, will become the more desire and more interest in exploiting these resources. Next slide, please, Jack. Not finally, but the next point, I think what we are observing is also the new geopolitics and the new geoeconomics, where economic sanctions, financial decoupling, and deplatforming or canceling of economic interactions is happening. For Norway, this is a huge change in the sense that Norway is a major financial actor through its government pension fund abroad, as it is called, with more than $1 trillion invested. And very interestingly, as a response to the invasion Russian invasion, the Norwegian Minister of Finance have decided to divest completely from Russia, actually terminating all their investments in Russia. And I think this will bring us into a new situation where we have to look much more carefully into investments. Next slide, please, and that will be my last slide. The change, and you alluded to this, Mike, we observe a changing geopolitics in the region. So there's now an increased strategic integration of the Barents Sea region and the Baltic Sea. The NATO membership issue is again very high on the agenda. And the picture you see here to the left is the president of Finland, Niinistö, talking to the president of the US, Joe Biden. And as you can see, they're calling also out to the Swedish Prime Minister. Joe Biden is calling the Swedish Prime Minister here. These Sweden and Finland are really rethinking their relationship with NATO, strengthening bilateral relations, and by that also changing the whole geostrategic compass in our region. These political initiatives are matched by a dramatic shift also in the public opinion that you see in the survey data there, that the support for NATO membership have really been strengthened in Finland and the same in Sweden. So I think that we are now in a, and I will end by this, basically saying that we are now in a dramatically new situation in the Arctic. We have to rethink the military posture. We have to rethink how we play out diplomacy, scientific cooperation. We have to think about our energy situation, have to think about the financial integration, and not least, we have to think about the changing nature of political alliances. So thank you so much, Mike. I give the floor back to you.
Oh, thank you so very much. I have many questions for you when we loop back around to that part. I want to make sure that our colleagues understand that they too can participate in this discussion. So for all of you watching, and if you have questions, please send them to us at our email, which is polar@wilsoncenter.org, polar@wilsoncenter.org. Oh, thank you very much. There are some threads there I'd like to pull, but I'm going to transition to Jim for the US perspective, but you simply, as you said, cannot decouple what's happening in real time right before our eyes. The fact that Finland and Sweden are contemplating their posture related to NATO, of course, bordering countries, Finland and Norway, and how quickly in 2 weeks the changes from at least a Norwegian perspective have evolved so much and so pervasive in almost all segments of economies and military and security and geopolitical posturing. So thank you for that. Jim, let me turn the floor over to you for a US perspective, and I thank you for joining us today.
Mike, thanks very much, and thanks for organizing this discussion, which is a really important one at this time. Good to be here with great colleagues. So last week we saw some financial news that Russia's credit rating had been reduced to junk status, and I think Russia's standing in the Arctic has also been reduced to junk status, because the Arctic is it's a region of strong rules and international law, commitment to sovereignty, territorial integrity, and when Russia violates those core principles so egregiously, not so far from the Arctic, how can it be otherwise that they lose standing everywhere? So, you know, it's a violation of principle, and it is, of course, a horrific event that that we are all looking at with revulsion and with deep feeling toward the human suffering that it's caused, and the heavy impact on the Ukrainian people, civilians, everybody there. So we took the decision together in the Arctic Council among the like-minded members to put a temporary pause on meetings of the Council and its subsidiary bodies, and to pause the work. And I will tell you, there's no joy in taking that decision. There's obviously no joy in any of this, but it was a very easy consensus among the like-minded members of the Arctic Council on the critical need for a pause. And I'd like to make just a few points about what that means and what some of our key considerations are as we look ahead. First, the words pause temporarily were chosen very deliberately. This is not a withdrawal from the Arctic Council. It's not a announcement that we're trying to reconstitute the Arctic Council, the membership. It's simply a pause in light of the horrific events and Russia's egregious, unprovoked, completely unnecessary war of choice against Ukraine. We don't know how long the pause will last. I think part of the logic here for simply pausing is that we are in a situation that is extremely fluid, and none of us can predict what the situation with Russia in Ukraine, elsewhere in Europe will look like a week from now, a month from now. It's highly unpredictable. And so we need this pause, and we need the ability to act flexibly in the days and the weeks ahead. And because the international situation is unpredictable, I think that there will be many important questions raised today in this discussion. A lot of them will be quite difficult to provide answers for, I think. But another point I want to make is we are as committed today as we have ever been to the Arctic Council as a forum. And so with all the changes that we have seen over the last couple of weeks, one thing that has not changed is our commitment to the Council as the premier forum for the Arctic region, as a circumpolar forum. And so as we move forward, we will always have at the front of our minds the question of how do we prevent damage to the Council? How do we make sure that we sustain the Arctic Council as that effective forum and make sure that it can continue to do its great work for the next 25 years? I can tell you also, we are very mindful of the impact of all this on the Indigenous communities who participate in the Arctic Council as permanent participants, and all of the communities, including in Russia. And the value of the Council to them and the value of the links that exist. And so we will be mindful of the interests of the communities as we move forward. And then finally, I would just want to say that, you know, we have been, as I said, lockstep with our like-minded partners in the Council, those who are absolutely committed to the principles under international law, territorial sovereignty, integrity. And we've been lockstep, will continue to be. We are consulting closely with our fellow Arctic Council members as we speak, and we will find our way through this together. Thanks very much.
Jim, thank you very much. I did want to make this a public square, so I want to go back and ask a follow-up question to Ulf, and then Jim, a follow-up question to you, and then we'll move on. Ulf, you noted the changes that may occur vis-a-vis Norway's ability to develop more of its resource, provide more of its energy resources to Europe and to the globe in this time when those resources are being eliminated off the market from Russia. Can you tell me how that's playing out in the energy sector? What things are happening that would allow Norway to produce more or provide more resource to the global markets? Without going into detail, I understand, but just at a 50,000 foot level, one or two insights into how that might play out.
Okay, I think we have to keep in mind that there's been a huge discussion on Europe moving out of energy because of climate change. So, and for investing in extracting oil and gas, typically in the high north, in the Arctic, you need the quite massive amount of investment, and you need some predictability that there will be a market there to take out those resources if you put them to the market. I think there's been a growing awareness in Norway and many other countries that maybe we will not, there will not be interest in buying gas and oil coming from the Arctic, so that we can keep it in the ground due to climate reasons. Now, I think that we see that the Europeans will, of course, they will want to move out of oil and gas, but they will probably at least need Norwegian oil and gas for a bit longer than before. So I think, in my view, now it looks like there will be increased interest in extracting oil and gas resources. And of course, the most important factor in doing this is the price. So since the price are rising, even unprofitable fields and resources are more likely to be extracted. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim, a quick follow-up. I know we are in a pause related to the Arctic Council. No one can predict, when a pause may be lifted. But can you give us a little bit of insight as to, or if there are activities happening now that would allow for the Arctic Council to start up at the appropriate time? And by that, I mean, how can we ensure that the work that has been done in the Arctic Council is at a place where, when the time is right, work can begin again, to the degree that you can foresee that?
Well, I think the senior Arctic officials of the like-minded Arctic Council members are taking a look at that. They're ensuring that that they have a good understanding of sort of all the different lines of effort that have been taking place. But they'll have to sort through that, and they'll have to make those decisions together. And we're not there yet, clearly. But I do want to make a point. I was in Canada last week, visited Ottawa and Quebec City and Toronto, and ended at the Arctic 360 conference, which was really good. And Russia was originally supposed to participate in that conference and had quite a prominent role. As it turned out, they were not there. That was the right decision for them not to be there. And the rest of us went on. And so I think, there were two good outcomes there. One was that Russia did not have the prominent role that it did not deserve at that event. But the other good outcome was that the rest of us moved on and continued with the discussion and with the work in that context, not an Arctic Council context, but in an Arctic context, and continue to have those discussions, continue to make those connections and look for opportunities. So that was a very good result.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Julie Kitko, who is the president of the Alaska Federation of Natives. Julie, thank you for joining us this morning or afternoon.
Thank you, Mike. As Mike introduced me, my name is Julie Kitka, and I have the honor of serving as the president of the Alaska Federation of Natives. Alaska Natives are a diverse group in Alaska, including Inupiat, Yupik, Eskimos, Athabascans, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian Indians, and Aleuts. We make up nearly 20% of the population in Alaska. Collectively, we're the largest private landowners in the state, retaining 44 million acres of land due to our land claim settlement, and the fact that the other large landowners are our federal government and our state government. There's many issues that we're focused on. Generally, we're not focused on international issues. Our issues are primarily domestic within the United States and internally within our community. We're in the midst of coming out of the COVID crisis on that, and we've had much success in protecting our people and strengthening our health system. And we have a lot of appreciation for the help that we've had in dealing with the COVID. situation. We deal with the challenges of climate change, has been noted in multiple forums and much more expertise than myself. And those are on a daily basis and very real to our communities. We have village relocation issues, we have erosion problems, concerns, and so on that. So in the midst of this, what we have been focused on is trying to have an economic recovery from the COVID prior to this invasion. On that, our primary focus has been infrastructure and what are our priorities in infrastructure development. So that's what we have been focused on. As a people, for many decades, we have been involved in unraveling the impacts of colonialization on our people. As you all know, at one point, Alaska was a colony of Russia, and we had many impacts from being a colony of Russia to then becoming a colony of the United States before Alaska became a territory and a state. So for our people, the idea of self-determination is something we believe in and have worked decades to increase. We've got many partnerships with other Indigenous people across the North on the area of self-determination and self-governance. In fact, I participated in many Arctic leaders forums over the years, including at one time I keynoted a speech in Tromsø, Norway, on an Indigenous women's conference. Self-determination to us is a right held by people to freely determine their political status and to freely pursue economic, social, and cultural development, a right held by people and not by governments only. Alaska Natives have a history of independence as a distinct cultures. We've been protected by isolation, as many Indigenous people in the North have been for a long, long time. Our people value freedom. We have the will and capacity to regain self-governance. And we can look at other parts of the world and think about events. And we know that there are dangers, and there are parts of dangers is thinking that we have an understanding of the events and what Russia's intentions are. We don't. We also do not control the competing sides in the conflict. But what we see is being portrayed is the sheer courage of the Ukrainian people and an astounding will to action and the confidence in the possibility of success. What we see there is them pursuing the right to self-determination, and where self-determination meets violence and threats. As we look closer to home, we see the many bridges that have been built in the Arctic, economic ties between industry, partnerships with countries with common interests, and an effort to keep the Arctic conflict-free and not militarized. We see the Arctic fisheries moratorium and protection of fisheries now even threatened by the conflict. We see transit on the waters are more uncertain. We see the rapid buildup of military bases on the Russian side and their exercises with submarines, warships, and planes a bit different now. We know the Russian economy depends on its Arctic development and contributes, I believe, about 20% to their national economy. We note that Exxon, Shell, and BP and others have walked away from their billions of dollars of investments with Russia, even Boeing and tech companies walking away. Economic activities that once were hugely valuable and a source of interconnectedness in the world. We're left with more questions now than answers. Where is our national energy policy in the United States? Where is our Arctic national security policy now? The leading questions that I would pose, which are primarily domestic internally in the United States, but one, we're uncertain about the fate of the Ukrainian people, and will they be a subject to just a blitz of violence, or will there be a negotiated settlement? We're all waiting for the next shoe to drop. Two, assuming things get sorted out, which we hope and pray that they do get sorted out, what will Russia do next? In many ways, it looks like its back is against the wall, and Mr. Putin will look very uncomfortably at all his relationships around the world. The sanctions create tremendous change and room for so many unintended consequences. We can't even imagine what the consequences will be around the world, let alone how that will affect the Arctic, will it affect our people. We have concerns for the unknown. We have the concerns for our people that use the waters, our whalers, our fishing fleets. How will the conflict spill out on people's use of the waters? What happens to US energy security? What happens with Exxon, Shell, and BP, as I said, exiting the Russian projects? How does that all sort out? What about the Biden administration? Can we fast track to Alaska production to help fill the needs? What about oil and gas development with an angry Russia on the other side of the Arctic Ocean? How does that occur? And then we read reports of Finland and Sweden possibly wanting to join NATO and Russia making threats about that, and we don't understand what that means. So in summary, it's very challenging times with many strategic implications for the future. We are not big players in this whole conflict or this area, but we are very, very focused on issues domestically and how the United States government will respond to issues in the Arctic and needs in the Arctic. And we have a lot of confidence that we will be working with the appropriate people within the administration. Probably one of our first biggest impacts is our prioritization of infrastructure. The US government has done unprecedented resources into infrastructure development, which we primarily were focusing on water and sanitation, village relocation, sustainable energy, resilience in our communities on that. And so we have concerns about the infrastructure development in our communities and how that's impacted by the conflict. So Mike, that gives you a top line on that. I'm not qualified to address all the other issues that you're dealing with, but that gives you an idea what's on our mind. Thank you.
Julie, thank you very, very much for that. It's very much central to these discussions. Let me ask you one quick follow-up question, please. And that is, for the last few years, you have worked very closely with the Alaska Command, NORTHCOM, and others to provide a forum for military leadership to engage with Alaska Native leaders around the state to inform their decision-making, but also to have a two-way dialogue. Can you just briefly give us a quick few sentences on that effort and where it is going in the future?
Thank you. Yes, we have been engaged with the U.S. military at the highest levels and with our command here in Alaska. And it has been about building relationships and building understanding. And I want to give you an example of how that has played out during this COVID crisis on that, to give you an idea of the uniqueness of that relationship that we have built. At a time when we had 15 swabs in 2 of our major hospitals, and we were at dire straits for personal protective equipment during the COVID, as many people were, as supply chains dried up. We worked with the military in 2 ways. We worked with our governor in getting a unified command set up, in which for the first time in Alaska's history, you had a unified command response on that. The Secretary of Defense executed that, and that was at our request. The second thing for getting personal protective equipment, we utilized a federal medical partnership and got transferred over 45,000 pieces of personal protective equipment, including N95 masks and other equipment in real time from wartime supplies of the United States military to our tribal health system at a time of our greatest needs. And I credit that transfer as shoring up our tribal health system and saving many lives during this COVID. But it's also been talking about larger events going on, what is happening in Russia, what is happening in China, what is happening in US national energy security and policy, as well as dual purpose infrastructure, common issues. I'd say it's a very vibrant and real partnership that's going on. It's based on trust and mutual respect, and we are continuing that partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And of course, as the issue in Ukraine unfolds and the highlight on the Arctic continues to be underscored, my sense is that this partnership will grow and become even more meaningful. So thank you for that. Let's transition now forward in the program. It's a pleasure to give the virtual floor to my friend, Dr. Ilana Wilson-Rowe. Ilana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. And thanks everyone for joining us here today. We are certainly in on an important topic and a difficult topic, as all the other previous speakers have also noted. Everything continues to unfold, and at the forefront of all of our minds is, of course, Ukraine and its people. But at the same time, as you were saying, Mike, in the opening remarks, it is becoming time for these serious considerations about how this changes the premises for diplomacy, for interstate relations in the Arctic, and also how global order is changing around the Arctic and will again be figuring into the politics there. There's no defensible return to any kind of new normal or even the post-2014 normal we had with Putin's Russia. But indeed, just as Ms. Julie Kitka was saying, this is about posing and reflecting on a landscape of still unfolding events and unexpected consequences. And I think the reflections we're doing today, of course, we're sharing very contingent thoughts, yet it's important to try to move the conversation forward. So I'm going to briefly share some thoughts on regional diplomacy, a few thoughts on kind of the broader order and how it changes, and also a few thoughts on looking to the future. So first, to regional diplomacy. I think we all share the opinion that the pause or the freeze, as we've heard in a couple other multilateral settings, was unavoidable. With respect for international law as a core key value of Arctic governance and really the shared constitution of the Arctic region, other paths were simply shut down by Russia's actions. And the pause was important because it ensured, of course, that the Arctic Council in the meantime could not be used for messaging any sort of business as usual opportunity for Russia after waging a completely unjustified and unconscionable war on a neighboring state. So we also saw similarly, for example, in the Barents Euro-Arctic Council in the Nordic and European Arctic, that projects or cooperation with Russia in that format was suspended. So slightly different than the Arctic Council framing, but a similar intention. And this tallies with what we see across the research world at the institutional level of suspensions of cooperation. For example, in Norway, where there are also some key exceptions around a few key areas such as fisheries. Initially, in thinking about this, I thought a lot of what my team and we've looked at over the years, speaking to those who have worked hard in making the Arctic Council work, that, for example, that Russian actors were not always able to be the most constructive in that cooperation, sometimes low engagement, and especially enduring problems of data availability and coordination that we can take, as articulations of divergent political systems and intensifying in that sense. At the same time, you would also hear these same participants report on important efforts and contributions made by individuals and institutions from Russia, and really these sorts of enduring professional and collegiate friendships that made some of the Arctic Council cooperation really work. And then, of course, the border crossing nature of several of the region's indigenous peoples who are so essential to creating and that the idea of circumpolar cooperation in the first place and making it happen. And our research on the networks around the Arctic Council do show that Russia has become very integrated in these networks. In many ways, the post-Cold War project of a community of Arctic policymaking was realized. At the same time, today, what we face is just an absolute necessity to think about how the other like-minded states, as Mr. Jim DeHart was saying, or the Arctic 7, as some others say, and indigenous peoples in the broader network of professionals can continue to work. And this is because, of course, a lot is changing, but not everything has changed. The Arctic climate continues to change, and the same challenges that were the focus of Arctic Council work, from environmental pollution to biodiversity to community health to unraveling the legacies of colonization through self-determination, as the previous speaker was addressing so eloquently, all of these challenges remain. And of course, a lot does happen and can be done at the national or subnational level, but this level of circumpolar cooperation has been important in making sure that the best solutions and best knowledge are shared, and that the order that's built up around a changing Arctic is consistent and cohesive. So I think there will be some mode in which this can go forward, this type of cooperation. And it's important also to note that these like-minded Arctic states actually meet in quite a few different multilateral settings. As Mr. DeHart was saying earlier about, it can be in the conferences like the Arctic 360 conference in Toronto, the Nordic Council of Ministers, many very strong bilateral and direct relations. And also to be reminded that one of the things that's made Arctic Council cooperation work so well is that it has been kind of a big tent. There's a lot going on. There's a diversity of actors. I'm sure at some point that's been a source of complexity and frustration, but really it is very much a source of strength in times like this. So that because it gives the opportunity to continue working on, for example, the project level, maybe looking to the sub-regional level to as a way of enhancing cooperation when the fully circumpolar cooperation is simply and rightly off the table. This, in some ways, I'm reminded a bit about, and someone will have to correct me if I'm remembering this wrong, but the early days of the Inuit circumpolar council meetings, where they would keep a chair at the table for their kind of Indigenous representatives from Russia, who are from the Soviet Union at that time, who were unable to travel. So how to continue to do the good work and perhaps keep a chair warm with the prospect of a future and perhaps a very different Russia to cooperate with. Now, I've spent probably too long on the Arctic Council, but I really think it is a microcosm of some of the broader relations that will continue to change. Just two last comments on order is that, of course, as Ulf Sverdrup, my colleague, was touching on, and others will be speaking at greater depth, there are changing security dynamics. The reduction of diplomatic contact in the Arctic with Russia was essential, yet at the same time, it certainly does take off the table a set of tools that were used on the assurance side of this assurance deterrence dynamic across the NATO-Russia divide in the region. So that means that this dynamic is now more even fully anchored in the military security field alone. These actors are well used to trying to managing that dynamic, but it's worth noting. And also, as some of the previous speakers also mentioned, that there is this China-Russia relationship is complicated and certainly an area to watch when it comes to the Arctic. There's a lot unfolding in these days to come about how far China will go in their at least support or at least non-condemnation of Russia. And it could, in the sanctions regime, indeed could force Russia more heavily onto Chinese finance or economic support. And these are not predictions, these are more dynamics about which we should be aware and consider. So that rapid development means that we should certainly keep an eye for changing patterns on China-Russia convergence. So just with an eye towards the future, I was struck by what you said, Mike, at the beginning about, how we're in a chapter. And there's a lot of a political science perspective that argues that, the world we have is maybe more forged by change rather than long-term trends or efforts. So this is also a moment, I think, that what's happened so far has been important to underlining a real commitment to international law and rules-based order in the Arctic. And perhaps we'll also see a chapter where the like-minded Arctic states and the permanent participants and the professional networks that support Arctic cooperation maybe will do more than just get by, but also consider how to improve and enhance and better represent the values of a rules-based order, including implementation to the fullest extent of agreements, inclusivity, and justice. So in these sad days, I think there's hope also in seeing how the like-minded Arctic countries have worked together, and we'll all be continuing to watch as these events continue to unfold. Thank you.
Lana, thank you for that. That was a tour de force of issues that we need to think about. I appreciate that. You noted one, many, but I've chosen, excuse me, one to follow up on, and that is your thought about the now perhaps more important than ever cooperation at the subnational or sub-regional level. Can you just give me an insight into what that might look like in your mind, to what degree, or even maybe an area or two that could unfold as a potential area that we could continue our good work in the Arctic while we work through the realities of our current day?
Thanks for that question, Mike. And I think it's, in some ways, it's about perhaps using existing settings. So the Nordic countries have this Nordic Council of Ministers or shared setting, which I think has long worked on Arctic issues and could serve as an enhanced focal point. And then I was also thinking, now I'm going to misquote some Arctic Council work, but a few years back, there was some interesting work around regional seas, kind of a cooperation going on around the Beaufort Sea, for example, thinking of how to enhance cooperation on those. So it's also about perhaps thinking, how can we, pivot to these sub-regional settings that have been well researched and apply some of the knowledge and perspectives of the Arctic Council, and also use all of the great capacity that's been built there to continue working on key challenges, even while the truly circumpolar perspective may remain paused.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now let me turn the floor over to our colleague, Marisol Maddox, who serves as a senior Arctic analyst at the Polar Institute. Marisol?
Did you want to go to Lawson first, or you want me to go?
Let's see. Well, no, you might as well just go, and then we'll go back to Lawson. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Great. Well, yes, thank you so much. And thank you for the remarks so far. We certainly have a lot to think about. So in order to be able to think about, to really appreciate the ways that the Arctic is impacted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I've been kind of breaking the questions that come up into different buckets. So around the economic implications, the security implications, the scientific implications, diplomatic implications, and community implications. But so I was also thinking, I've been thinking obviously a lot about this, and just over the weekend, really just kind of reflecting on, because I've never seen something like this play out in real time in such agonizing detail, and the grief and rage that is a part of living through this experience and feeling like we're so limited in our ability to do something, I feel like it's a wise teacher in a way. And I think that one of the more profound questions that comes up is, as we're seeing, this region that has just such an incredibly traumatic history, and we're seeing this new surge of just trauma being built, and these, all the kids and everything. So what I think is really interesting to think about is, what is the role of the Arctic policy community in addressing internationally and domestically some of these patterns of intergenerational trauma that get built up, and what are the opportunities that we have for the way that we frame our approach to try to intervene where we can, and to try to stop some of these patterns that are just so destructive and very corrosive in terms of building the resilience that we want to see in these communities. And so, this is where I think about, concepts like the One Health framework that recognizes the inherent interconnectivity between human, environmental, and animal health, and kind of thinking about, coming from this place of strength in our response, as opposed to one of rage, which is very easy to just be, so angry. And I'm seeing a lot of calls for things like, that kind of more vindictive towards the Russian people. And so I want to kind of call that out as an example of something that's not coming from a place of strength, where it's really, creating policies that are constructive towards focusing on strengthening the people who ultimately are the ones who are most impacted by these policies. And so I've been really heartened by the way that we have been so united so far in the response, with the Arctic 7 issuing this, the joint statement, and just seeing, just incredible unity so far. And I think that that's really inspiring, and that's really something to make sure that we are, that we are continuing with, and that in our response, that we have, consider a more humane policy towards the Russian people. So things like, denying visas for Russians who want to live, study, work, visit other places in the world. I think that that's really not constructive, and that actually, by preventing Russians from leaving Russia, it really strengthens the narrative that the Kremlin is pushing forward in a domestic sense. And I think it's also really important to think about, as we are posing, questions, very valid questions, as the very foundation of Arctic cooperation through the Arctic Council is being challenged, especially with Russia as chair. How do we respond to that in a way that doesn't preclude the potential for on-ramps for Russia in the future? Because now, before this invasion, the idea of there being a potential coup against Putin was, pretty non-existent. But, things are changing, and especially the way that we're seeing Putin lashing out domestically at some pretty high level folks, and just having miscalculated so poorly, having time for NATO and other countries to be providing resources to Ukraine, and Ukraine just showing up like nobody expected. And it's been absolutely incredible to see just the integrity and the honor that they have brought to this situation. And so I guess I also just want to be careful about, and anything that might deviate from the Arctic 8, which has been such a strong and very clear concept, really does open up the possibilities for alternative arguments from states who may want to argue that they should have a stronger role in the region. And I'm specifically talking about China. China has been very careful in the way that they have engaged in the Arctic. They use a lot of the language that we like to hear about rules-based order and, just abiding by, being an observer and contributing in, productive ways around scientific research. But they have also been building their equities in the region, some through financial, foreign direct investment, but also through engaging in things like the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. And there had been, a strong desire for the Arctic Council and this Arctic 8 construct to really continue to be the predominant forum for regional decision making, and that included things around Arctic ocean governance. So for the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement and the management body that will eventually need to be created, there's discussion about expansion of the Arctic Council mandate that would take that role. Or for instance, with the BB&J agreement and implementing that in the Arctic, that there's interest from the Arctic Council in doing that. And so that's just one of the challenging things I think we have to grapple with. And I was really encouraged by Jim's remarks about, just the pause that is being taken, no hasty decision making, no hasty decisions are being made. That this pause allows for kind of wise decision making to take place. And this is just something that is really challenging, because we do need to deny Russia of the platform that they get from being chair of the Arctic Council to assert themselves as a peer, because this is just such an egregious violation of European countries' sovereignty. But at the same time, we also need to grapple with the reality of how the region is changing, and climate change isn't going to wait for us to get some of have interoperability between Arctic coast guards or greater response capability before opening up. And we have cruise companies that are supposed to be going up in April next month, like, the earliest ever for this particular cruise company. And so seeing things like the Arctic Coast Guard Forum being on pause, of course, that's very necessary. And COVID was very disruptive in terms of preventing Arctic Guardian exercise from happening in person, so that needed to be remote. So we were hoping that Russia, as chair of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, would be able to host an in-person exercise in the Russian Arctic this year, which clearly that's not going to happen. But the ability for, I think that what we saw with the Arctic Guardian exercise being virtual was that you can still make progress on simulating a scenario and having the relevant stakeholders from whichever Arctic nations can be present to be able to talk through the response as if it's happening in real time, to make sure that they know who the contacts are they need to be talking to, that they understand what assets certain countries have and what they don't have. So I think there definitely are ways to be, finding these modalities for cooperation on areas where we really can't afford to fail. And then, just in terms of the scientific research, there's the concern of, the lack of comprehensive data from a massive portion of the Arctic at a time when the region is changing 3 times faster than the rest of the world. And specifically around even Russia sharing their fisheries data from their side of the Bering Strait region, especially related to permafrost, and researchers from other parts of the world being able to get into Russia to conduct their research. So all of these are, those are challenges, and maybe certain things won't be possible. But I think, certain questions that could be helpful are, how can projects be potentially reframed so that they're able to gather the best data possible to answer the questions that need to be answered with, given the constraints that exist. And then I did also just want to note that we also saw transnational organized crime increasing a lot during COVID, because it's just these criminal groups around the world are so opportunistic, and things like e-commerce just make it easier. And illicit trade in Russia is going to flourish under these sanctions. And there's a lot of these transnational criminal groups in Russia are connected to the state. And so that's also a concern in terms of the ways that they could be instrumentalized against Russia's neighbors, especially with, Finland's question, considering joining NATO, that's also something that is of concern. And there was actually a 2015 Europol report specifically was looking at future crime, and the Arctic was a region of interest, and Europe was actually really supposed to be a place where, just because of the way that climate change is opening the region up, that there's a lot more vulnerabilities in terms of new drug markets, new routes for things like just trade-based money laundering or arms smuggling. And so all of these are things to consider as we are, undoubtedly these groups will be strengthening within Russia. And I think that one thing for the Arctic policy community to consider is specifically related to sustainable development, and whether it's the Arctic Economic Council or the Sustainable Development Working Group, even though it's on pause now, like specifically and explicitly incorporating active transparency and anti-corruption measures is more important than ever, because that helps to just create fewer opportunities for bad actors to have a corrosive influence on economic development in the region, because it's one of the tools that Russia could use to be more of a spoiler in the region, because a weakened Russia is not a safer Russia. And there's a lot of different dimensions of risk that are evolving that impact, all of the different buckets that I mentioned. So I'll stop there, but obviously it's a lot to dig into.
Marisol, thank you. That was a nesting doll of important issues, all wrapped together. I do want to follow up with you. I'm going to move on, but I do want to come back to you on a couple of things if we have time. We got about 30 minutes left. I want to make sure we get our partners in to ask some questions, but the issue of transnational crime in particular, you have followed quite closely. So I may want to follow up with you on that particular item. But let's move forward in the interest of time. Lawson, I skipped over you there for a reason. I think that a lot of the narrative here has arced to the world that you follow, which is the Russian Maritime Arctic, including shipping and other items. So let me turn the floor over to you, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Good day, everyone. I'll try to focus on some of the maritime shipping issues, maybe a few points about the impacts of Ukraine on the Russian Arctic development and the relationship to energy. I think all of us have to remember that, of course, this place is oceans and coastal, and many of the indigenous people of the Arctic live along the coast. And so maritime issues are central, and cooperation amongst all of the 8 Arctic states and not many non-Arctic states is important to the future of the Arctic. Step back a moment, where can we actually work with the Russians and the Russian Federation on practical cross-border maritime operations? Those must continue. They did during the Cold War. And I'm speaking about the long border between Norway and Russia in the Barents Sea, the long border between the United States and Russia in the Bering and Chukchi Seas. These relationships in the practical maritime world among the Coast Guards, and in Russia's case, the FSB, surely should continue, at least in search and rescue, maybe response in some disaster situation. It's not quite clear where joint fisheries law enforcement can continue, but nonetheless, this is part of maintaining maritime stability, what Ulf suggested. This is a practical maritime world, so those relationships on the operational front must continue. That said, now we have an Arctic SAR agreement, 2011, and the Arctic Oil Pollution Preparedness and Response Agreement. Operationalizing those might be pretty challenging today and in the future. Both require, of course, the closest of cooperation among the 8 Arctic states, both civil and military organizations. Of course, we know that Russian military is heavily involved in things like search and rescue. So how that plays out in the future is a question. One of the major challenges in operationalizing these treaties is the movement of equipment across borders, particularly for environmental response. How might that happen in this new world order? And as Marisol suggested, most of us were hoping that with the Russian Arctic Chair that both PAIM and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum would orchestrate exercises within Russian Arctic waters during their chairmanship so that all of us could observe their infrastructure, how they respond to incidents, and none of that's happening. I don't see any of that happening in the future. Many of us were also hoping that during this chairmanship and moving into the future chairmanships of the Arctic Council and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, there could be more cooperation among the Arctic states in implementation and enforcement, the IMO Polar Code, practical work that's integral to enhancing marine safety, environmental protection for all of the Arctic, the environment itself, but really for coastal communities. All of this is on hold. Whether it can be moved forward is a question. All of that cooperation on practical IMO issues are disrupted. Clearly, there isn't the possibility of meetings in the near term. They're certainly paused for the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, with the FSB being in the chair, of course, and the Arctic Council. Hard to believe you could have discussions on economic development when there are a wide range of sanctions limiting trade connections with Russia. So from a practical standpoint, those are not possible. It was interesting during the early part of the Russian Arctic chair that Russia was using the Arctic Council, I would say, and the Arctic Economic Council to market international use of the Northern Sea Route and the Northeast Passage. This effort is on pause for sure, and I believe it likely will never again be viable. The Arctic states certainly can't have members threatening another, as many have discussed already. But it is fascinating that Jim and everyone will know is that during the May 2021 Arctic Council Ministerial, the focus was on peaceful, stable, cooperative Arctic that Mike mentioned. The words coming from Foreign Minister Lavrov himself. So that certainly has changed the whole dynamic. And that's clearly why the Arctic Council is in pause mode. Let me comment a little bit about this future of trans-Arctic trade routes, another practical issue, lots of misinformation and hype about it, sailing ships across the Arctic Ocean in a new ice-free, at least partially ice-free ocean in the world. Well, that's not happening. Clearly in the future, in the Russian Maritime Arctic, use of the Northeast Passage and the Northern Sea Route, likely for trans-Arctic navigations, is never going to happen this century. Let me give you an example that when the Ever Given, the large container ship, was stuck in the Suez Canal last March. In fact, right away, President Putin and his ministers proclaimed the trans-Arctic route open for business, across the Russian Maritime Arctic. Certainly visionary, but even then implausible, because the place is ice covered for half the year, maybe in 2050. And then last November, from again another practical issue with regard to navigation in the Arctic, there are some 20 ships stuck in the Russian Arctic from about November to January in the East Siberian Sea. So trans-Arctic navigation, even practical regional navigation, was greatly disrupted, and gave a good example, indicated with a large rescue operation, the vagaries of Arctic navigation, the complexities of using this place. So you couple this recent experience with Ukraine and Mr. Putin's vision for a transshipment container operation, attracting global shipping, all of this is dead. Such an operation, even supported by the Russian government, requires global cooperation, investment in infrastructure, involves shippers, insurance companies, and the whole of the global shipping enterprise. And without central and close cooperation, none of this can happen. So, in summary, for the Northern Sea Route, clearly we're back to Russia's Arctic National Waterway. It's a domestic waterway. And clearly, I think we see that LNG, oil tankers, or whatever, will be moving eastward to Chinese markets. The long-term strategy before Ukraine by the Russian Federation was to tease away from European deliveries, at least by ship, and move energy cargoes to the east. So we'll see the Russians continue to attempt to achieve year-round navigation to the east in difficult waters through Bering Strait, from the Ob Gulf to China in particular. Maybe some deliveries to Korea and Japan, but mostly to China. One more comment about Ukraine and the disruption of global shipping and supply chains, not necessarily Arctic. But anytime you have Maersk, Mediterranean Shipping Company, MSC, French CMA, Germany's Hapag-Lloyd, et cetera, all suspending traffic to and from Russia, it's going to disrupt global shipping. The United States and UK and now some European ports closing its ports to Russian-owned and operated ships. How will this impact Arctic, particularly Murmansk, is not clear. But just when you look at the LNG icebreaking carriers that are taking LNG out of the open Gulf from Sabetta to global markets, one of these ships is owned by Russia. All the rest are owned by international shipping companies. All of those ships are flag of convenience ships. Where do they go? Where do they sail? What ports can they enter? It's an extraordinary impact on global shipping. Global shipping, again, is a hugely complex, integrated, interconnected industry, maybe even more so than energy, but they're similar to the world's great and large industries driving globalization. And this disruption and closure of ports it has immense impact on the global oceans, clearly, but clearly on regional interest and the future of Arctic marine interests. I mean, I'll stop here, just remind us all it's a new world of the Arctic, driven by uncertainty and complexity, particularly in the maritime world. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawson, for all of that. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some questions. We do have some from the audience, but I want to make sure that we have our colleague Katarina have her perspectives on this issue. So Katarina, I'm going to turn the virtual floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. One of the questions we were asked to consider is how Russia's invasion will impact or can impact military security and NATO policies in the Arctic in particular. So I'll dedicate the next 3 to 5 minutes to some thinking about NATO and hard security issues in particular. I'd start by saying that NATO at this moment does not have an Arctic strategy or a clear Arctic policy. And its approach to the Arctic has been traditionally very cautious. NATO as an alliance works by consensus, so any decision that would concern the Arctic would have to be agreed upon unanimously by 30 member states. And because that consensus wasn't there, the Arctic did not feature in the strategic concept, which was adopted in 2010. And overall, the northern dimension has not been discussed as often as eastern or southern dimension or fight against terrorism. It did, however, appear in the text of the Brussels summit communique in June last year. So since 2014, there has been growing pressure on NATO to rethink its strategic approach to the region. And I think that over the past 4 or 5 years, there has really been a visible shift in NATO's approach towards the Arctic, from the Trident Juncture exercise in 2018, which was conducted under an Article 5 scenario, to the establishment of Joint Force Command Norfolk in 2019. And as we heard, cold response exercise, which is taking place every other year and which is kicking off today. And at this moment, NATO is in the process of drafting its new strategic concept, which is expected to be approved at the upcoming NATO summit in Madrid in June. And it's the second most important document after the Washington Treaty, which will set the direction for the coming 10 years. And it is expected that there will be much more emphasis on defense and deterrence. And it is an opportunity for NATO to reevaluate its approach to the Arctic, but also its approach towards Russia and China in particular, which did not feature at all in the strategic concept adopted in 2010. So I'd say that the decisions NATO sets now will really set the tone for the next 10 years. A few points on Russia. As we have heard during the introductory presentation, there hasn't been any increase of Russian military activity in the European Arctic, nor any change in the military posture. And this has been confirmed by both Norwegian and Finnish officials. And it is also believed that Russia has relocated some of the land forces from the Kola Peninsula to fight in Ukraine. So it is unlikely that Russia would purposefully expand the war to the high north in any way that is related to the situation in Ukraine. So the only way this would happen is if the war in Ukraine escalated to become a regional war involving NATO and the EU. And that would only be a result of the Euro-Atlantic community deciding to become involved. But on the whole, neither NATO nor Russia are interested in a direct confrontation in the Arctic. And then coming back to the cold response exercise, Russia has always been very sensitive to NATO and allied exercises in the high north. I'd say that the main reason is that they take place in the proximity of the Kola Peninsula, which has a strategic importance to Russia. That's where its sea-based strategic nuclear forces are located, protected by the Northern Fleet. And this is simply why Russia is more sensitive to NATO exercises in and around the Barents Sea than it is to those exercises that take place in the Mediterranean. And we saw during the Trident Juncture exercise that there were different types of Russian behavior, from disruption of GPS signals to the Northern Fleet launching several ad hoc drills in the waters outside Norway. So I'd say that because of its timing, location, and scale, cold response will likely make waves. And I'd say that on the one hand, because of what happened in Ukraine, this exercise is more important than ever. It is important for deterrence, for messaging, and it also provides assurance to allies. And not doing this exercise could have been read by Putin as lack of resolve. So it's a classic deterrence bind. So I think it's also vital that NATO can demonstrate the ability to operate across the width and the breadth of Europe, so from fjords in Norway to sandy beaches in Turkey. That's also very important in terms of messaging. But at the same time, there's always this risk of unintended escalation. And because of that, extra efforts must be considered to address potential incidents, accidents, or misunderstandings. And the United States, Norway, and NATO have already established mechanisms for transparency and risk reduction, including inviting Russia to observe the exercise under the Vienna document provisions. So I think that if we look ahead, it is likely that we will see more military activity in the Arctic as a means of deterrence. But I do expect that most Russian activities will be those that fall beyond the threshold of Article 5 scenario, such as hybrid operations, including disinformation campaigns and electoral interference. So these are the types of activities I expect we will be seeing more of rather than any direct military confrontation. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina. This has been, so thank you, colleagues. This has been a tour de force and exactly what we had expected, that we would cover a wide swath of issues. And in the future, working with our colleagues at NUPI, conducting more of these more focused town halls on this issue and how it's impacting the Arctic. So this is exactly what we were. I thank you all. Our friends at the Wilson Center have figured out a way for us to go 10 minutes more. So those of you who can stay with us, please do. It simply is a rich framework for us to consider. And I want to make sure that we have at least some questions from the audience. I want to thank you all, colleagues from around the world, sending us questions. We're not going to get to anywhere close, but they are certainly in line with the other issues that we had thought about moving forward on. One from the Premier of the Northwest Territories, the Honorable Carolyn Cochran. She asks a question, and Ilana and others, please jump in perhaps on this, but maybe Ilana, I would put you on the spot here for a moment. in short, the Premier is asking, how is Russia most likely to challenge the international order in the Arctic? And the word challenge jumps out at me, of course, but some thoughts on that.
Oh, that's a fantastic question coming to us from the Northwest Territories. I think it is important to keep in mind that in the Arctic, Russia is quite well served by international law and international order. So it's when I had, some others may want to jump in as well, but I would say that I think what has come to is the point in Russia's internal developments where, of course, the level of hypocrisy and violence and autocratic tendencies in other sectors of Russia's geographic areas in Ukraine and elsewhere has reached a point where it's just no longer possible to give them the same role in the region that a purely interest-based and very partial adherence to international law would give. So I guess I think that's a great question. That would be my very early and partial answer, that Russia is well served by international law in the Arctic, so perhaps not super likely to seek to challenge it there, but the reaction of the other Arctic states in the broader community is more based on the fact of how, to what extent Russia's partial engagement and support for international law can be accepted, and clearly it can't be.
Thank you for letting me put you on the spot there. Does anyone else want to briefly touch on that subject before I move on to another question? I'm searching my screens. Marisol, please.
I just want to add one thing, and that is that, so one of the things that has made Russia, has incentivized Russia to have the region be an area of peaceful cooperation is not only, of course, that, the Kola Peninsula houses their bastion defense concept, and that's very important to them, but the economic potential of the Arctic has been a huge driver for Russia to engage in a constructive way. And so it is notable that there is a massive flight of capital from private sector that is separate from the sanctions, which are crippling in and of themselves. But even if we see Russia, take a more positive turn, and obviously that's not likely, that building that capital back is very challenging, especially as Putin is threatening to nationalize certain things like factories that companies are vacating, potentially not returning planes that have been leased. So these are all huge red flags for companies that would otherwise be interested in investing in Russia. And so if their ability, obviously they're looking more towards Asia now for some financing, but it is interesting and significant to note that their ability to realize the economic potential of their Arctic is less likely now that they're facing massive sanctions and the capital flight.
Thank you. Ilana, you wanted to follow up, and then Lawson.
I did. Thanks, Marisol, for that, taking that conversation over to economic issues, because I think what it really raises is the specter of considering of how rational is policymaking in Putin's Russia happening right now. And I think in response to that question, on the one hand, seen objectively from the outside, that Russia is well served by international law in the region on the whole. But what we've seen is also a real weakening of kind of in the policymaking circles around Putin, a real weakening of those who might have argued for a concern for Russia's economic future, a concern for these types of kind of economic interdependencies that we've long hoped would facilitate a pragmatic approach to the West, even as the political value systems diverged. So I guess in sum, you could say that the answer in the end could be nothing and everything. And unfortunately, that's the best one I can come up with in these very unsettled times at the moment.
Thank you. Lawson, please.
Yeah, because the Russians have always wanted to have a peaceful Arctic to sell stuff to the world. What they have is natural resources. To put a bit more specifics on it, if you look at two large projects ongoing, LNG-2, which is a large LNG facility orchestrated all by Novatech and international partners, and Vostok oil project, a large project, again in the Russian Arctic near the old Gulf, orchestrated by Rosneft. Well, when you have BP and Shell and ExxonMobil, Equinor, and others suspend all investments and operations in the Russian Arctic, especially, for example, 20%, 18.5% or so of Rosneft's project in the Arctic was supported by BP, really does put some sort of pause, maybe slow Arctic oil and gas development. So the interplay between investments, the future of the Russian Arctic, and then the connection, of course, with climate change and mitigation efforts globally, the specter of the future of Arctic oil and gas development in the Russian Arctic has taken a hit near term and likely has a troubled future long term.
Thank you, Lawson. I'm juggling questions here from our colleagues, but I have a question, Jim. Jim, I have a question for you and maybe some others, and then Julie, I'm going to come to you for a specific question as well. Jim, if you don't mind, and then others, please weigh in. The question is from our colleague, Larry Hensman, who says, China has been emerging as a global power over the past few decades, and particularly in the past decade, has accelerated their interests and investments in the Arctic. How will Russia's request for military support from China affect Arctic science and international Arctic politics? I think the real crux of it is, how does this relationship, how could the relationship between Russia and China impact probably all geopolitics in the Arctic, including that of the research and scientific community?
Yeah, Mike and Larry, also thank you. This is an easy one because my answer is I don't know, but I think look, I think with China we already had a situation where the relationship between Russia and China in the Arctic is a bit transactional, with some Russian desire obviously for Chinese financing, but some deep unease with an expanded Chinese presence in the Arctic. And I think we don't know at this time what Russia's relationship with China is going to look like. You know, a lot of discussion of this and a lot of questions already raised. You know, how comfortable is Beijing with what has happened in Ukraine and with the general notion that a nation can change borders by force, invade another country, violate its sovereignty in such an egregious way? Many of Beijing's longstanding statements suggest that they should be uneasy about this, and we'll see how this evolves I think in the weeks ahead. We've made it clear, as our National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan did very recently, that Beijing should not be helping Russia avoid sanctions. So they, you know, we will watch with great attention to see how China responds to this situation. We're going to stay attentive to Chinese behavior in the Arctic. I think all of our partners have grown more attentive to their desire for infrastructure, their dual-use science platforms, and how they're using those, and all of that. But in a lot of respects, I think real early to tell. But you know, while we're on the subject of Russia and China too, just to go back to your the last question, Mike, which I think really spoke to the impossibility of compartmentalizing key principles, core principles of international law, right? You cannot be an egregious violator of those principles in one place and then sort of stop at the border of the next place. You know, Russia and China have basically put forward different models that are not based on the principles that we hold to be so important. And essentially Russia asserting now an approach where might makes right, you know, not international law. And, you know, our view is that these principles are universal. They don't stop at any particular border. You can't apply them in one region and not another. And that's why we're approaching this situation in the Arctic as we are. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. That's certainly your latter point has certainly been I'll just say a point of spirited discussion in the last 2 weeks, but certainly over the weekend, which has linked China and its actions in the South China Sea to their narrative related to the North. And now, certainly over the weekend, you probably got them too, many discussions liking that to one set of rules for Russia in the Arctic, but how can that be, on issues related to Ukraine and in Europe? And so there's this rapid dialogue going on about that. You can't apply international norms in one place and then not follow them in the other. And the Arctic is right in the middle of that nexus there. So thank you for highlighting that. I do want to, we have about 5 minutes left. Julie, I have a question for you. It was very specific actually to the Arctic Council and Indigenous peoples and their ability, the openness of Russia to allow Indigenous peoples to have voice related to the Arctic in the Arctic Council pre-Ukraine invasion. But going forward, the question really is, what role can Indigenous people play in shaping what will become the future Arctic? What role is there in the Arctic Council, but outside the Arctic Council, specifically for organizations like the Alaska Federation of Natives? How does your voice, the perspective of understanding it's not monolithic, how does the influence from Indigenous peoples play into this broader geopolitical challenge we have at the moment? But even if we didn't have an invasion of Ukraine, the individual is interested in the role and effort of organizations like AFN domestically and internationally.
Well, thanks, Mike. As you know, AFN is not a permanent participant in the Arctic Council. We were invited to early on, and we chose not to allow greater representation from our people in cross borders, the Inuit Circumpolar Conference and Allieds International and Athabascans. Had we accepted a seat on that, it would have precluded them from having participation. And so we chose not to participate. Again, our focus is primarily domestic within the United States, as well as building up the capacity of our people. We have nothing but respect for our brothers and sisters across the Arctic, and have engaged in numerous leadership forums on specific subjects and topics and sharing experiences on that. So we hope that that continues. I don't know how AFN continues its involvement. Again, we are a federation of all our organizations. We have much diversity in our group. We have our Native corporations that were formed. We formed after our land claims that pursue primarily our economic interests on that. We have our tribal consortiums, our health system, and so on. So we have much work domestically just to keep things on track in what we're doing. I did want to throw one item into the discussion. And again, it's just because my interest in reading about things over the years is wanted to recommend to your audience a book that the World Bank put out about 20 years ago called When Things Fall Apart. And it talked about the increase in poverty when the Soviet Union broke apart. And it goes country by country. And that I remember getting that years ago, reading about it, and was quite appalled with what the impacts on the people in the different population areas. And the reason I raised that book in the discussion is I think we have to be careful of continuing to learn what is on people in mind in that area and their experience, because it also applies to our understanding of China. If you're seeing that China is asserting that as historical grievances of how it's been mistreated Russia would do the same thing. And I think it's important for us to understand or try to understand that history, not to buy into the grievances, because we don't even want to buy into our own domestic grievances, go into the grievance culture. We want to be proactive on that. But I do think it's important to understand their perspectives and have a deeper understanding of that so we know what they're even talking about. How will we go forward? Clearly, most of that is engagement with our own government, our local state government, our legislature, our national government, ways that we can help, ways of increasing the dialogue and figuring out what makes sense. Again, we're dramatically impacted by the breakages and the linkages between people, both on the economic front, but also the social and cultural ones. We have family that are in Russia. We do have family members in Canada and Greenland and many ties on that. In many ways, it's really saddening to see things break apart, these dialogues, and we hope that we'll come through this and there'll be a way to maintain those ties. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Let me thank all of my colleagues on the screen today for giving their, in real time, as this issue unfolds, giving their perspectives on where we are. Ulf, I'd like to give you the floor for some wrapping comments, and then I will close out our program today.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike. I have three key takeaway points from this very interesting session. First is that Putin's war has, of course, created huge ripple effects into the Arctic. And these geopolitical tensions are not originating in the Arctic, but the notion that the Arctic can buffer out and be a separate sphere is no longer valid. It is in the Arctic as well. So that's the first point. Secondly, what you have heard today is that these tensions, this new geopolitical normality, if you call it that, will affect all kinds of dimensions: military, economic, diplomatic, legal aspects, and also the people-to-people cooperation. And it will affect the Arctic countries and also affect countries outside of the Arctic. The third point is that we are faced with uncertainty, deep uncertainty. Uncertainty about, of course, what will go on in Ukraine, uncertainty about what will happen to Russia, what will happen to Putin's regime, and also uncertainty about the strength of European unity and the transatlantic ties. So we should take this uncertainty into account. We should be cautious and careful about jumping rapidly to conclusions, I think. We should be firm, but at the same time careful about undermining what we have already established. That's why I appreciate very much what Jim said about this temporary suspension. So this is a huge responsibility on all of us to be firm, but at the same time, try to see what we can, try to find solutions. And also, I think it's important that we have developed formats for like-minded to come together to deal with the issues of great importance that we somehow have to tackle anyhow. And I think that all the panelists today have contributed to this, to help us to deal with uncertainty, and at the same time be a bit modest in presenting radical new proposals for radical changes. So I think this is a good start, Mike, and look forward to the continued cooperation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for that excellent summary. And I think we do have the foundation of a series of discussions like this. And I too appreciate our colleagues' insights, but also the measured approach to responding to what is unfolding before us. I want to thank everyone who has joined us today. Again, we had 775 friends and colleagues register for this program. We've gone way over. So Treon, thank you in the broadcast studio for helping us to do that. It simply needed to happen in this way with these colleagues. So I thank you, Treon, and the friends at the Wilson Center colleagues today who have been speaking and providing their insights. I thank you all as we all grapple with what the contours of this new Arctic will be. And for everyone else, know that both the Wilson Center's Polar Institute and NUPI will now consider how we bring these dialogues forward in format and in substance, and we'll look forward to bringing you those dialogues in the very near future. So thank you all very much. To my friends and colleagues, thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to our next set of discussions. Have a very good morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you.